Hello, my name is Shawn Hawkins. I'm an associate professor in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department. Over the last several years, I've been doing experiments with poultry litter here at Milan, looking at whether it can be used as an alternative fertilizer for corn and soybeans in rotation, for continuous corn, and also for cotton. And I'm going to show some of the results for that study, which has been ongoing now for 3 years in today's presentation. Poultry litter is a readily available alternative fertilizer in Northwest Tennessee. On this map right here of Tennessee, I've got integrated broiler companies, which most of the growers for these companies send meat chickens into processing plants. The processing plants are shown, and in addition to that, primary breeder plants are shown throughout the state. And you can see in Northwest Tennessee, we have two facilities, one in Humboldt in Gibson County and the other in Union City in Obion County. Those are our two leading cotton producing counties. And so part of the reason to consider litter as an alternative fertilizer for cotton, of course, fertilizer prices are high, but it also is readily available in areas of our state where we grow cotton. I find that many folks, producers, don't really understand the characteristics of broiler litter and the nutrient profile. Obviously, you should always ask for an analysis because different poultry producers use different techniques inside their houses that can affect the nutrient content of the litter. But generally speaking, it's about a 3-3-3 fertilizer with 60 pounds of nitrogen, 60 pounds of P2O5, and 60 pounds of potash per ton as is. Sometimes the values are a little lower than this, perhaps 50 pounds of each of these nutrients, and occasionally the nutrient content can be a little high. So ask for a representative analysis if you're considering using it. One of the critical factors to consider is that the nitrogen is not all crop available. Only about 50% of the nitrogen is crop available, and I'm going to show that there's little or no of the carryover nitrogen available in subsequent crop seasons. That'll be some of the data that we look at today. The P and K can be considered to be 100% crop available, and it will carry over from year to year, and if it's not consumed and then removed in crop residues, and it will build up in soils, and I'll show some of that data today. Really, the most important factor to consider when you're considering using broiler litter is your soil test. The soil test and your yield goals, those are vital information. And just using some current prices for nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium fertilizers, you can see that if you do need all three of these nutrients, it really maximizes the value of the litter just in terms of its fertilizer equivalent. Obviously, there's costs associated with obtaining and applying it, and that should be considered, but the value can be quite high. To give row crop producers in Northwest Tennessee some idea of the scale of litter nutrient production, I've got here a summary. I think this is 2019 data of the crop phosphorus and potassium removal from our primary crops grown in this region: corn, soybean, wheat, and cotton. And you can see that I've got totals here for each of these for phosphorus and potassium. And I'm going to make special note of the cotton here in particular. 6.6 million pounds roughly of phosphorus is removed per year in cotton harvest, and 8.9 million pounds of potassium. And we're going to put that in perspective with the amount of litter phosphorus and potassium that's going to be produced at the farms that are going to be growing for these two complexes in Gibson and Obion County. Again, to add some perspective for that crop removal data set that I just showed you, here I've got the cotton mineral removal rates for Northwest Tennessee, and I'm comparing that with the amount of litter mineral supply of these two nutrients, and you can see that in fact the litter from the production of poultry in Northwest Tennessee provides more phosphorus and potassium than is actually removed for in our cotton harvest, which means that in essence we could supply all of the phosphorus and potassium for all of the cotton that's currently being planted in Northwest Tennessee. And again, that represents a significant value in terms of the current cost for these fertilizers. So now I'd like to consider a good cotton fertilization strategy when you're using litter. My recommendation, based on what we've seen over the last several years, is to apply 2 tons of litter per acre just before planting. And that should provide about 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen. Remember, about 50% of it is available, and it contains 60 pounds of nitrogen per ton roughly. So that would be somewhere around 40 to 60 pounds, and then it would provide all of the phosphorus and potassium that would typically be required to grow cotton, remembering that that should be 100% of crop available. So after planting the cotton, I think the best application of nitrogen would be to side dress the nitrogen at first square, as recommended by Dr. Raper. And that would be yield and N based. And it can be tricky because litter is a source of organic nitrogen, and the amount of that nitrogen that becomes available in any given year is a function of many things, including weather and temperature and rainfall are 2 important factors. And also the fact that we grow cotton throughout the summer. It's a little bit tricky, I would say, to predict the amount of nitrogen that's needed for side dress. So that would have to be yield and N-based, and probably you should be considering some in-season assessments using, for example, the petioles, leaves, to make an assessment of nitrogen needed, for that side dress application. Here I'm showing the UT Extension cotton fertilizer application rate recommendations, and you can see as much as 120 pounds of potassium is required for cotton, assuming that you have a low testing soil, and in fact you would be able to provide all of that potassium if you were to apply 2 tons of litter, and in the case of medium testing soils, you'd actually be expected to build some soil phosphorus and potassium over time, because your application rate, if you applied litter year in and year out and consecutively, you would see a buildup of phosphorus and potassium simply because you're applying more than is being removed in the crop residues. Here are the results from our study. You can see that we have a negative control, a positive control, and then we have different rates of litter, 2, 3, 4 tons per acre of litter, and that's both with and without supplemental nitrogen. And you can see that in 2019, certainly we did need the supplemental nitrogen. The yields were all equivalent with litter as long as supplemental nitrogen was used, but they were certainly lower than the positive control, and many of the controls that include both litter and urea being applied. And so that is a good indication that in that particular year we didn't have good nitrogen release from the litter. And in 2020, there were basically no differences between any of the treatments. So obviously in that year you would have been able to use the litter without supplemental nitrogen. Unfortunately in 2021 we were not able to obtain good results because nitrogen was applied on all of the plots. But we have enough data to certainly say that litter on cotton gives mixed results, and I think that has to do with the fact that you have to be careful with nitrogen management for this particular crop if you're going to use litter as an alternative fertilizer. In the fall of 2021, we did collect cores from our different treatments on our cotton study. And over the next several slides, I'm going to show you some of those results. Again, I'd like to go over the treatments. It was 2, 3, and 4 tons of litter per acre, and that was both with and without 70 pounds of nitrogen being added. And I would also say that on those plots that received litter, none of them received phosphorus or potassium or sulfur. The positive and negative control received 60 pounds P2O5 an acre, 90 pounds of potash, and also 12 pounds of sulfur applied as ammonium sulfate, which means that in the case of the negative control, there was a small amount of nitrogen added. And then for the positive control, of course, we did side dress that with 70 pounds of nitrogen. We didn't see any significant effects after 3 years of litter applications on soil organic nitrogen or organic carbon. Partly that's maybe because we were focusing on the top 6 inches of soil. If we had focused on perhaps the top 3 inches of soil, we may have seen a significant difference, but at 6 inches we see no difference, and we didn't see any differences in soil moisture or density at the time that we collected the samples. We are working to establish some other soil health indicators for these plots, and we'll see whether or not those differences play out. But right now, most of the what we would refer to as soil health benefits, we don't see it after 3 years, even at 4 tons an acre for 3 years in a row. Well, I'll show you we do have some carryover nitrogen to the fall after 3 years, but it's a small amount. But I think the main point here is that we did have significant effects on the mineral nutrients, in particular phosphorus, potassium, boron, and I'll show you a couple of others also from a corn and soybean study that we're currently doing with cotton with litter. Here we have the 3rd year fall carryover of nitrate and nitrite nitrogen. This would be nitrogen that would be plant available. And with organic nitrogen sources such as litter, we do expect that some of the nitrogen that is broken down from the organic matter will become available outside of the normal growing season. And you do see a significant difference here, for example, in the 0 to 15 centimeter depth, which would be roughly 0 to 6 inches. 4 tons of litter did have a higher carryover nitrate concentration than the negative and positive controls, and we even saw that effect with the deeper soil core that we looked at, the 15 to 30 centimeter depth. We did see significant differences in the concentrations for the higher rates of litter versus the negative control. I think the take-home message, though, is that even if we squeeze an extra 10 pounds in the spring or fall for carryover, it's not a significant amount, and we shouldn't be counting on that, to produce any portion of yield either for a fall planted crop or for the next crop season. Here I've got the soil phosphorus concentrations for our different treatments for our cotton plots after 3 years, and you can see that there is in fact a buildup of soil phosphorus. The concentrations do increase as our application rates of litter increase, and there is a significant difference after 3 years between the plots that receive 4 tons of litter 3 years consecutively. The phosphorus concentration is in the high range, and you can see that that's significantly higher in the 0 to 15 centimeter depth, that is 0 to 6 inches roughly, for the negative and the positive control, which are currently testing low. There was a significant difference in terms of just the analysis of all of the data for the 6 to 12 inch depth, but the concentrations are obviously small, and that's related to the fact that phosphorus is not a mobile nutrient. It's insoluble and is expected to accumulate on and within the soil surface. To show the effect of litter applications on soil test potassium concentrations, I'd like to switch from the cotton study in which we applied a large amount of potassium 3 years running for our positive and negative controls to a corn and soybean study that I've been conducting using litter as a fertilizer. Litter was applied in 2019 to corn and again in 2021 to produce corn in a corn and soybean rotation. So the bars that you see are soil test potassium results for our plot site A, which was established in 2019. All of the bars that are yellow correspond to years when we applied litter and when we were producing corn, and the green is for years in which we're producing soybean. And you can see, if you focus on the 2022 results before we planted soybean, that those 2 years of litter applications resulted in a significant increase in soil potassium concentrations versus the positive and negative control, and that would be particularly for the 4-ton rate and the 7-ton rate that we're applying to corn. So just an explicit demonstration that litter is able to provide potassium and enrich plant available potassium in soils. It's not just nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium that litter can supply, and we've shown this in several studies at a couple of different of our experiment stations at this point. I'm giving an example here of zinc from the cotton plots after 3 years, and you can see that there is some addition of zinc to the soil profile when we do land apply litter for cotton production. And same would be true for a number of other nutrients, including, for example, boron and also copper. And I'll show you here in just a second that even sulfur in the litter can be used to produce crops. So I've included here a snapshot of some of the data for a corn and soybean rotation study that we've been fertilizing with just litter. No additional nitrogen was used in this particular study. And one thing that I'd like to show is that we do have evidence from the earleaf, the corn earleaf concentrations of sulfur, that in fact the litter is able to supply sulfur that is plant available. You can see in 2021 that there is a steady increase in the earleaf sulfur concentration as our litter application rate increased. So I'd like to summarize some take-home messages from today's presentation and the study that we've conducted fertilizing cotton with litter so far. I think the 2-ton litter rate is a good rate for cotton. It should be, of course, applied at planting. The reason I believe it's a good rate is because it supplies all of the P and the K that should be needed to produce this crop, 120 pounds of each nutrient. The tricky part is that it supplies most but not all of the nitrogen in any given year. That's going to vary from year to year. So you should consider some in-season nitrogen assessment. We've seen that in the first year of the study. I don't believe that we had good nitrogen release from the litter. One thing to consider is that the carryover nitrogen is small. So even after 3 years of using litter, we see very little organic breakdown of nitrogen, release of nitrogen in the fall or the spring. I haven't shown that data, but also the spring. So that shouldn't be counted on. I do believe that the study provides evidence that there's good, litter is a good source for mineral fertilizers for cotton or for corn or soybeans, or in fact for any row crop. It's a good source of primary mineral nutrients, phosphorus and potassium. And we do have good evidence that litter supplies other plant nutrients, including sulfur, boron, zinc, and copper. And undoubtedly there's other benefits to the soil health profile that we're still considering. I've got my cell phone number here. You're free to call that number if you have any questions about today's presentation, or if you have more detailed questions, please feel free to send me an email at my email address here, shawkins@utk.edu. Thank you.